In 1909, a man named Abraham Flexner visited 155 medical schools across the United States and Canada. He was not a doctor. He had no medical training. He was an educator, hired by the Carnegie Foundation and funded in part by the Rockefeller philanthropies. His job was to evaluate American medical education and write a report. When that report was published in 1910, it triggered the closure of more than half of all medical schools in the country. In 1904, before the report, there were 160 medical schools educating over 28,000 students. By 1920, there were 85. By 1935, there were 66. Among the first to close, every school teaching eclectic medicine. Eclectic physicians were licensed doctors, trained in anatomy, pathology, and bacteriology, who also used botanical remedies drawn from European, Native American, and African healing traditions. They had practiced in the United States for nearly a century. Their movement had begun in Cincinnati in the 1830s, founded by physicians who rejected the brutality of mainstream 19th century medicine, bloodletting, mercury purges, arsenic compounds, in favor of plant-based remedies with documented, observable effects. They had published detailed materia medica documenting exactly which plants they used, for which conditions, and with what results. Their flagship reference, King's American Dispensatory, ran to nearly 2,000 pages of clinical botanical documentation. By 1939, the last eclectic medical school had graduated its final class. In 1990, the herbalist Michael Moore visited the Lloyd Library in Cincinnati, Ohio. In the basement, he found the accumulated libraries of every eclectic medical school that had ever operated in America. All the books, all the records, all the documented clinical observations, slowly molding in boxes. They had been shipped there one by one as each school closed. He described what he found as a discipline of medicine that had treated the patient rather than the pathology, a vitalist healing system as sophisticated as traditional Chinese medicine, as documented as any contemporary medical school's curriculum, and it was disintegrating in front of his eyes. This is not a fringe claim. It is documented history, recorded in the herbalist's own words and confirmed by the existence of the Lloyd Library, which still holds those books today. This video is about 7 of the plants those physicians used, plants that were listed in the official United States Pharmacopoeia before 1910 and removed from mainstream medical training shortly after, and what modern peer-reviewed science now says about each of them. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. Before 1910, approximately 40% of all official medicinal preparations in the United States were crude plant extracts. Cannabis, willow bark, golden seal, echinacea, and valerian root were all listed in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, the official federal document that defined what counted as medicine in America. Medicinal herbs were planted near hospitals and medical facilities. Medical school curricula included training in the identification, preparation, and clinical application of botanical remedies. Physicians routinely prescribed plant tinctures alongside surgery and chemical drugs. The knowledge had been accumulated over generations, refined by clinical use, and documented in the same peer-reviewed publications where laboratory science was also advancing. Then came the Flexner Report. Its stated goal was to raise standards, and in some respects, it succeeded. It eliminated schools with no laboratories, no hospital access, and no anatomical training. Many of those schools were genuinely inadequate. This part of the reform served patients. But it also contained a structural bias that was not incidental. The schools that received the highest ratings in the Flexner Report were the schools that the Rockefeller philanthropies had already begun funding. The General Education Board, Rockefeller's grant-giving organization, distributed at least $180 million to medical schools between 1910 and 1930. Almost exclusively to schools teaching pharmaceutical-based, surgery-centered medicine. Abraham Flexner was hired by that same organization in 1912, shortly after his report was published. He worked for Rockefeller until 1928, directing the distribution of the funds that enforced his own report's recommendations. A plant cannot be patented. A synthetic drug derived from a plant's active compound can. John D. Rockefeller had built his fortune in oil. By the early 1900s, he controlled over 90% of U.S. oil refining through Standard Oil. Scientists at the time were discovering that petrochemicals, byproducts of petroleum, could be used to synthesize pharmaceutical compounds. Aspirin had been synthesized in 1897 from salicylic acid, originally derived from willow bark. The model was clear. identify the active compound in a plant, synthesize it from petroleum derivatives, patent it, and sell it indefinitely. A medical system built around patentable synthetic compounds was a medical system that created perpetual revenue. A medical system built around plants that anyone could grow, harvest, and prepare at home generated no revenue for anyone who had just invested millions in pharmaceutical production infrastructure. This is not speculation about intent. It is a description of the financial incentive structure that peer-reviewed medical historians have documented. The result, the near total removal of botanical medicine from American medical education within a single generation, is historical record. What follows is what was lost, and what modern science now says about each plant. Plant 1, golden seal. Hydrastis canadensis. The Cherokee had used golden seal for centuries, as a wound treatment, a digestive remedy, and an eye wash. Eclectic physicians adopted it in the 1830s and made it one of the most heavily prescribed plants in their materia medica. It was removed from mainstream medical training after 1910. In 2011, researchers at the University of North Carolina published a peer-reviewed study in antimicrobial agents and chemotherapy, demonstrating that whole golden seal extract showed synergistic antibacterial activity that exceeded the effect of its primary active compound, berberine, alone. The extract inhibited bacterial efflux pumps, the same mechanism by which bacteria develop resistance to antibiotics. In 2012, the same research group published in Planta Medica documenting golden seal's activity against methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, MRSA, one of the most dangerous antibiotic-resistant bacteria in the world. Berberine, the primary alkaloid in golden seal, has since been studied for antibacterial, anti-inflammatory, blood sugar regulation, and cardiovascular effects in dozens of peer-reviewed trials. The eclectic physicians knew it worked. It took 80 years after their schools closed for researchers to begin explaining why. Plant 2, Echinacea. The Lakota used it for infections and snake bites. The eclectic physicians used it as an immune stimulant and wound treatment. It was listed in the National Formulary, the secondary official pharmaceutical guide, from 1916 to 1950, when it was quietly removed. Modern research has produced a contested but substantial body of evidence. A 1999 randomized controlled trial published in the American Journal of Medicine found that Echinacea extract reduced the incidence and severity of colds and respiratory infections. Multiple subsequent meta-analyses have produced mixed results, some showing modest but statistically significant reduction in cold duration, others showing no effect. The critical detail? Echinacea is not a single compound. It is a complex mixture of polysaccharides, glycoproteins, and alkamides, the proportions of which vary by species, plant part, preparation method, and time of harvest. Most studies testing a standardized extract of one species cannot be compared to studies testing a tincture of a different species. The plant does something. Isolating exactly what it does and under what conditions is complicated by the fact that it was not the kind of compound the pharmaceutical research infrastructure was designed to study. Plant 3, valerian root, Valeriana officinalis. Valerian has been used as a sleep aid and anxiety treatment since at least the time of ancient Greece. It was listed in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia until 1936. It was prescribed by eclectic physicians for nervous exhaustion, anxiety, and insomnia. A double-blind study published in Pharmacology, Biochemistry, and Behavior in 1989 found that an aqueous extract of valerian root improved sleep quality in human subjects. A meta-analysis of 16 clinical trials published in the American Journal of Medicine in 2006 concluded that valerian may improve sleep quality without producing side effects, though the authors noted that evidence was not strong enough to make definitive claims. Valerian is now legally sold in the United States as a dietary supplement. It is prescribed by physicians in Germany under the Commission E monographs as a recognized sleep aid. It has never re-entered the American medical curriculum. Plant 4, St. John's wort, Hypericum perforatum. Eclectic physicians used it for nerve pain, anxiety, and wound healing. It was a standard botanical preparation in the late 1800s. It left the mainstream medical curriculum after 1910. A 1996 meta-analysis published in the BMJ, one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world, analyzed 23 randomized clinical trials and concluded that St. John's wort was significantly more effective than placebo for mild to moderate depression, and similarly effective to standard antidepressants with fewer side effects. As of today, St. John's wort is prescribed by physicians across Germany, where botanical medicine was not subjected to the same dismantling that occurred in America after the Flexner report. It is the most studied herbal antidepressant in the world. In the United States, it is sold as a supplement. A doctor cannot legally prescribe it. Insurance will not cover it. The primary pharmaceutical alternatives, SSRIs, cost between $30 and $200 per month depending on the drug and the dose. St. John's wort is a weed. It grows on roadsides. It costs almost nothing to grow. Plant 5, Lobelia, Lobelia inflata. Samuel Thompson, the founder of the botanical medicine movement that preceded the eclectic physicians, made lobelia his primary remedy in the early 1800s. It was used as a respiratory antispasmodic, a bronchial dilator, and an emetic to clear the lungs. Lobeline, the primary alkaloid in lobelia, was studied in the 20th century as a nicotine substitute and potential treatment for respiratory disorders. Research published in the Journal of Pharmacology and Experimental Therapeutics has documented lobeline's action on dopamine transporters, with potential implications for addiction treatment. It is a plant that was central to American botanical medicine for a century before 1910, and has been almost entirely absent from medical education in the century since. Plant 6, hawthorn, Crataegus species. Eclectic physicians used hawthorn for heart conditions, specifically arrhythmia, high blood pressure, and cardiac weakness. It was one of the most commonly prescribed cardiac botanicals before 1910. A series of clinical trials published in peer-reviewed cardiology journals have since documented hawthorn berry extract's effects on cardiovascular function. A 2008 Cochrane review, the gold standard of systematic medical evidence, analyzed 14 randomized controlled trials and concluded that hawthorn extract produced statistically significant improvements in exercise tolerance and reduced symptoms of shortness of breath and fatigue in patients with chronic heart failure. A 2003 double-blind trial published in the European Journal of Heart Failure found that hawthorn extract improved heart function in patients with chronic cardiac failure when taken alongside conventional medication. It is not prescribed by American cardiologists. It is studied and prescribed in Germany, Austria, and the United Kingdom. In the United States, it is a dietary supplement. The pharmaceutical alternatives for heart failure management cost between $1,000 and $5,000 per month for a single drug. Hawthorn extract, standardized pharmaceutical grade, costs approximately $15 to $40 per month. Plant 7, slippery elm, Ulmus rubra. Native Americans used the inner bark of slippery elm as a food, a wound poultice, and a throat and digestive remedy. Eclectic physicians used it extensively for gastrointestinal inflammation, throat irritation, and as a nutrient for patients who could not tolerate solid food. It was listed in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia until 1960. Slippery elm bark contains mucilage, a class of complex polysaccharides that form a gel-like coating on mucosal surfaces. The mechanism of action is straightforward. The mucilage coats the throat, esophagus, and digestive tract, reducing irritation and inflammation. Modern research is limited, primarily because mucilaginous plants are extremely difficult to patent. They cannot be synthesized, and therefore have attracted almost no pharmaceutical research funding. The mechanism, however, is not disputed. It works the way it was always said to work. No one has found the money to run the large-scale trials that would allow it to be classified as a drug rather than a supplement. There is a pattern across all 7 of these plants. Every one of them was in clinical use by licensed physicians for decades before 1910. Every one was documented in official pharmaceutical references. Every one was removed from mainstream medical training within a single generation of the Flexner report. And in every case where modern research has looked, which is not all cases because research funding reliably follows patentable compounds, the findings have been at minimum consistent with the traditional use, and in several cases substantially more significant than expected. The global pharmaceutical industry is worth over $1.5 trillion annually. A plant that grows in a field, requires no patent, cannot be synthesized into a proprietary compound, and has been in documented clinical use for a century has no place in that economy. This is not a conspiracy. It is a business model. The incentives are visible to anyone who looks at where research money goes and who profits from the answer. According to the World Health Organization, approximately 25% of pharmaceutical drugs prescribed globally contain active compounds first identified in plants. The compound gets isolated, synthesized, patented, and sold. The plant that contained it for millions of years gets reclassified as a supplement, a folk remedy, or a dietary herb, legally barred from making health claims without the clinical trials that only the pharmaceutical industry can afford to fund. The eclectic physicians who filled those molding books in Cincinnati were not unscientific. They were unlucrative. Here is the uncomfortable truth this video will not hide. These plants are not pharmaceuticals. They are not interchangeable with pharmaceuticals. Several of them have known drug interactions that can be genuinely dangerous. St. John's wort affects the cytochrome P450 enzyme system, the same metabolic pathway that processes dozens of commonly prescribed drugs. It can reduce blood levels of birth control pills, antiretrovirals for HIV, certain heart medications, and immunosuppressants used after organ transplants. Someone taking St. John's wort alongside these drugs without knowing about the interaction could experience treatment failure. Golden seal similarly affects cytochrome P450 enzymes and can alter the metabolism of other drugs. Valerian, taken with sedatives or alcohol, can compound sedation in ways that are not always predictable. These interactions are known, they are documented. They are the reason that any serious discussion of botanical medicine has to include a frank acknowledgement that these are biologically active substances, not inert supplements, and that biological activity cuts in multiple directions. None of the plants in this video should be used as a replacement for medical treatment without understanding the specific mechanisms, contraindications, and interactions that the research has identified. What they represent is not a replacement system. It is a body of documented knowledge that was removed from medical training not because it failed, but because it was not profitable to keep it. The difference between a physician who has been trained in botanical medicine and one who has not is not a difference in ideology. It is a difference in available tools. A doctor who has never been taught that hawthorn extract has a Cochrane-reviewed evidence base for heart failure cannot make an informed recommendation about it. A doctor who has never been taught that St. John's wort is as effective as standard antidepressants for mild to moderate depression in multiple meta-analyses cannot offer it as an option, or warn a patient who is already using it about the drug interactions that make it dangerous to combine with their other prescriptions. The gap is not in the science. The gap is in the education. And the education gap was created in 1910 by a report written by a man with no medical training, funded by an oil baron with a financial interest in the outcome, and enforced by an institution that distributed $180 million to make sure the right schools survived. The plants did not fail their patients. The institutions that trained the next generation of physicians simply stopped teaching them. There is a quiet kind of sovereignty in knowing what grows in your region, what it has been used for, and what the current evidence says about it. It does not require rejecting modern medicine. Modern medicine is exceptional at what it is designed for: acute trauma, infection, surgery, crisis intervention. The pharmaceutical advances of the 20th century, antibiotics, vaccines, surgical anesthesia, represent genuine miracles of human ingenuity. What it requires is acknowledging that between 1910 and today, an entire vocabulary of botanical knowledge was systematically removed from the institutions that train the people we trust with our health, and that the reason it was removed was not that it failed, it is that it could not be owned. Approximately 1/4 of all pharmaceutical drugs currently prescribed worldwide are derived from plant compounds. The molecules were first found in plants. They were then synthesized, patented, and sold. The original plant, the one that native peoples and eclectic physicians used for generations, receives none of the credit and generates none of the revenue. The plants in this video are not cures. They are not miracles. They are organisms that evolved alongside human beings across thousands of years of coexistence, and that produce compounds which interact with human biology in ways that are increasingly well understood. The eclectic physicians who documented those interactions were not practicing superstition. They were practicing medicine with the tools they had: careful observation, clinical record keeping, and accumulated empirical knowledge. By the standards of their time, they were rigorous. The system that replaced them is more rigorous. It is also, by design, more expensive, more dependent, and more profitable for those who build it. That vocabulary still exists. The research is rebuilding it. The plants have not changed. The knowledge is waiting to be recovered. Not by returning to 1890, but by asking why we stopped learning from what worked, and who benefited from the silence.